Hettie Calloway washed Silas Marren's shirts for 12 years. The morning he accused her of stealing one, he docked a week's wages. Then, he made her thank him for keeping her on. She did not argue. She did not weep. She went home and wrote the date in her ledger, in a small hand, the way she wrote everything. 12 years, and at the cattlemen's church social, before the whole congregation, 60 souls in their Sunday best, Marren threw a bundle of shirts at her feet. He looked down at her on the floorboards, and he said, loud enough for the back pews, "A woman who washes a man's shirts learns his size, nothing more." That same week the Vance homestead burned. There was a man still in the barn. What Silas Marren never asked was why his laundress had never once thrown a ruined shirt away. He never wondered what she kept in the cedar trunk at the foot of her bed. 5 shirts. Each one still smelling of coal oil smoke. Each one dated. If you have ever been treated as invisible while you saw everything, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find something in you, subscribe and stay a while. And do me a kindness. Comment the town or the county you are watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story rides. Now come with me back to Ashford Crossing, in the Wyoming Territory, in the dry autumn of the year, when a laundress was the last thing any powerful man thought to fear. The valley was called Sweetbriar, though there was little sweet about it by the time this tale begins. It was cattle country, grass to the horizon in the good months, hardpan and wind in the bad. Ashford Crossing sat where the wagon road forded the creek, a single street of false front stores, a bank, a church with a leaning steeple, and a scatter of homesteads out along the bottoms where the water still ran. The homesteaders had come with the railroad talk, filed their claims, broke the sod, and planted. The cattlemen had been there before them, and did not care for fences. Hettie Calloway lived at the far end of that street, in a plank house no bigger than a granary, with a laundry shed built onto the back. Her husband Amos had raised both with his own hands before the coughing sickness took him 3 winters gone. She was 51 years old, wide through the shoulders from the work, gray coming in at the temples. Her hands were red and cracked from the lie, and steady, always steady. She had a plain, quiet face that most folks in that town could not have described to you an hour after they'd passed her on the walk. That was how she liked it. She washed for half the valley. The Bar M was her steadiest account, the big Marren ranch out past the north fence, and it was the Bar M wage that stood between her and the county poorhouse. She knew that. She never once let herself forget it. A widow with no kin and no land had 2 choices in that country. She could work, or she could be a burden on the charity of people who had none to spare. Hettie worked. Mondays she boiled water before the sun cleared the ridge. Tuesdays she wrung and starched. By Wednesday the line behind her shed was a white sail of shirts and sheets snapping in the wind, and men rode in from 3 directions to fetch their clean things. She knew every collar in the valley. She knew whose wife had a heavy hand with the darning. She knew which rancher slept in his clothes when he was drinking. A shirt tells you a great deal, if you are the one who has to get it clean. There was a thing she did that the town knew about and mostly forgot. When a family lost someone, Hettie washed the mourning clothes for free. The black dress, the good dark suit, the little coats for the children. She would not take a coin for it. She had buried Amos in a shirt she'd boiled and pressed until it shone, because it was the last thing she could give him, and she understood in her bones what it meant to hand a grieving woman back her dead man's collar, looking like something that mattered. So when the Ostergaard boy drowned, she washed his burial suit for nothing. When old Mrs. Delgado passed, the black came to Hettie's line and went back without a bill. The valley did not thank her much. But the widows remembered, in the quiet way that widows remember things. She kept a ledger. It sat on the shelf above her wash bench, a cloth-bound book Amos had bought her the first year they married, and in it she wrote every account. The date. The name. What came in, what went back, what was owed. She could not have told you why she was so careful about it, except that careful was all she had. A poor woman with a clean book cannot be called a liar quite so easily. She had learned that lesson young, and she had learned it hard, and she meant never to learn it again. Now I have to tell you about the shirt, because everything that comes after grows out of it. It was 3 summers back, in the 2nd year of her widowhood, when the grief was still fresh enough to make her clumsy. She'd been washing for the Marren house maybe a year by then. Silas Marren came to fetch his linen himself that day, which he almost never did, and he counted the shirts on the porch rail one by one, the way a man counts money he doesn't trust you with. He counted 11. He said he'd sent 12. Hettie knew there had been 11. She had written it in her book that morning. 11 shirts, the bar M and the date. But Silas Marren was a big man in a fine coat, and she was a laundress on her own porch, and when he said 12, the number 12 became the truth, because that is how it works when one person has everything and the other has nothing. He docked her $2 for the shirt. He docked her a week's wage besides, for the insult, he said, of being robbed by help he'd taken on out of Christian charity. And then, and this is the part she never told a living soul, he stood there and waited. He waited until she understood what he wanted. And she gave it to him. She said, "Thank you, Miss Marren, for keeping me on." She said it because the alternative was the poorhouse, and the poorhouse had no mercy in it at all. She went inside. She did not cry until he'd ridden off. Then she took down her ledger, and she wrote the date, and beside it she wrote, plainly, the whole of it. 11 shirts. Docked $2 and a week for a shirt that was never sent. And under that she made herself a rule, the way a careful woman makes a rule she means to keep forever. Never again would she let a garment out of her hands without a record, and never again would she throw one away. Every shirt too scorched to save, every collar torn past mending, everything a man told her to burn as ruined, she would keep. She would fold it, and she would pin the wash date to it out of her ledger, and she would set it aside, where no one could ever again stand on her porch and turn 11 into 12. It was not vengeance. She did not have a vengeful bone that she knew of. It was bookkeeping. It was the only armor a poor woman could stitch for herself out of nothing. She had an old cedar trunk at the foot of her bed. It had been her mother's, and it smelled of the West, dry and clean, and moths did not touch what she kept in it. Into that trunk went the condemned shirts. One here, one there, over the seasons. A poor woman's insurance. She thought no more about it than that. Neither, I promise you, did anyone else. Silas Marren would sooner have wondered what his boots were thinking than what his laundress kept in a box. Now the first of the shirts that matters. I want you to hold on to this one. It came in on a Tuesday morning in the fall that Amos had died the winter before, so the grief was still close, and Hettie was still counting every dollar twice. The night before, the Ostergaard homestead had burned. Not the boy who drowned, another family entirely, out on the West Bench. Word came down the road early. The house and the barn both gone in the dark, the family run off with what they could carry, the land black. Lightning, some said, though there'd been no storm. A stove left banked, others said. Hard country. Things burn. The Bar M wash came in as it always did, hauled by a ranch hand, and Hettie sorted it on her bench the way she'd sorted 10,000 loads. And she stopped, because one of Silas Marren's fine linen shirts, the good ones he wore to the cattlemen's meetings in Cheyenne, came to her hand reeking. Not of sweat. Not of horse. Of smoke. Deep, oily, coal oil smoke. The kind that gets into the weave and will not come out no matter how hard you boil it. The cuff was singed brown along the edge, the way a sleeve scorches when a man reaches into a fire he built too high. She boiled it. She scrubbed it. She hung it in the wind 2 days. The smell stayed. It was condemned, and by her own rule a condemned shirt went into the trunk with its date. So she folded it, and she pinned the date to it, and she carried it in and laid it in the cedar trunk, and she thought about it exactly as long as it took to do that. She needed the wage. Silas Marren's business was not hers. A laundress who wondered aloud where a rich man's shirt had been smoking would be a laundress on the road with her furniture in a handcart. She said nothing. She wrote nothing but the date. That is the whole of it. One shirt. Her silence and her proof folded into the same square of linen, and neither of them knowing yet what the other was. The trouble began to gather that season, though Hettie stood too close to the ground to see the shape of it. There was a company now, the Cattlemen's Trust, that Silas Marren spoke for. When a homestead failed, when a family gave up and moved off a burned or ruined claim, the trust was there quick with cash money, $40 for a claim that ought to have brought 10 times that. And the failed homesteader took it, because $40 in the hand beats a black field and a dead dream every time. The deeds went into the bank in town, and the bank clerk entered them in his book, and the grass went back to cattle. Hettie knew none of this in any way she could have explained. But she washed the bank clerk's shirts, and she washed the trust men's shirts. And a woman who handles a man's linen learns his habits whether she wants to or not. She simply had not yet put the habits together. The offenses came in threes, the way trouble does when a powerful man has decided you are beneath his notice. The first was small and private. Estelle Marren, the Baron's wife, paid the laundry accounts, and Estelle had a way of finding a fault to shave a bill. One week she held up a shirt to the window and found a scorch on the tail, a little brown iron mark, and she docked Hettie $1 for the ruin of it. Hettie had not scorched that shirt. She knew her irons, and she knew her heat, and she'd not put a mark on a thing in 20 years of the work. But Estelle was the wife of the man who signed the wage, and so Hettie stood on the fine porch with her hands folded and took the $1 off her own pay and said nothing. She wrote it in her book that night. The date. The $1. Docked, unjust, the book did not forget, even when Hettie had to pretend to. The second came a month on, and it had a witness. Silas Marren met her at the ranch gate one gray afternoon when she'd hauled the clean things out herself, and he told her, flat, that linen had gone missing from his house. Good linen. Table things, a set of pillow slips. He said it in front of Deuce Halloran, his foreman, a lean, hard-handed man who did the ranch's rough work and asked no questions about it. Marren said if another thread went missing he would have her run out of the county, laundress or no, and he'd see she never took in another man's wash in the territory. Halloran stood by his horse and grinned at the ground. Hettie said she had taken nothing, quietly, once, because to say it twice would have been to argue, and a servant does not argue. Then, she took the wash he still owed her for, and drove her cart home and wrote it in the book. The threat. The witness. The date. And between these things, the valley kept burning. The Delgado claim went in the night, out on the South Fork. The Kessler cabin a few weeks after, up the draw. Each time, a family broke and sold cheap to the trust. Each time, in the paper that came up from Cheyenne, there was Silas Marren's name at a cattleman's banquet 200 miles east, or at a stockman's meeting, or dining with the territorial men, plainly and publicly away, with witnesses of standing to swear it. And each time, a day or two after, a Bar M shirt came to Hettie's bench smelling of coal oil, cuff or collar singed, and each time by her own iron rule, she boiled it, and failed to save it, and folded it, and pinned its date, and laid it in the cedar trunk beside the others. She was not counting. That is the thing you have to understand. She was not building a case. She was a poor widow following a rule she'd made to keep from being robbed, and the rule was quietly gathering, in a box at the foot of her bed, a dated record of a range war that not one soul in the territory of Wyoming knew existed. 3 shirts, then 4. She could not have told you the number if you'd asked. She never opened the trunk to look. Why would she? It was full of ruin, and ruin is not a thing a body cares to look at twice. Now I have to bring you to the church, because this is where the man reached too far, the way cruel men always do at last. They cannot help it. Contempt is a cup that has to be filled to the brim and then poured out where the crowd can see, or it gives them no pleasure at all. It was the harvest social, the last warm Sunday before the weather turned, and the whole congregation was there. Tables under the cottonwoods, the women's pies and the men's talk of prices and grass. 60 souls, near enough, for it was the one day of the year the far homesteaders and the ranch families and the town all stood on the same ground. Hettie came because she always came, in her one good dark dress, and she stood at the edge the way she stood at the edge of everything, useful and unseen, helping the church ladies with the coffee urns, because a widow makes herself useful, or she has no place at all. Silas Marren came in his broadcloth with Estelle on his arm, and he was in a temper that day, though only his own people could have read it. A homesteaders' committee had gone to the territorial land office about the fires. Nothing had come of it, nothing ever did, but it had cost him a morning of soothing men who mattered, and it had put it into his head that the valley was growing bold, and a man like that, when he feels the reins slip even an inch, has to snatch them back hard in front of everyone so the whole team remembers who drives. He found his reason in Hettie. He always could find a reason. He walked up to her at the coffee table with a bundle under his arm, a rolled bundle of his own shirts she'd sent home clean the week before, and the talk around them died the way talk does when a big man's voice rises. He said she was a thief. He said things had gone on going missing from his house, and he'd been a fool and a soft Christian to keep her on this long. And he took that bundle of clean shirts and he threw it down at her feet, into the dust in front of 60 of her neighbors, and he told her she was finished. 12 years, and finished, in front of them all. She bent to pick the shirts up. I want you to see her do it. She did not shout. She did not fall to weeping or beg or defend herself. She bent, in her good dark dress, and she began to gather his clean shirts out of the dirt, folding them against her chest, because they were clean and she had made them clean, and it was not in her to leave good work in the dust even then. And Silas Marren looked down at the top of her graying head, at the servant on her knees before the whole valley, and he smiled, and he said the thing. He said it slow, so the back tables would catch it. A woman who washes a man's shirts learns his size, nothing more. And 60 souls heard it. Some laughed. The ones who laughed at whatever Marren wanted laughed at. Some looked at their shoes. The homesteaders' wives looked at Hettie on her knees, and their faces went hard and still. But not one of them stood up. Not one. Because he was the bar M and the trust and the note on half their futures, and she was the laundress, and that is the arithmetic of a place where one man owns the water. Hettie stood up with his shirts folded over her arm. She looked at him. She did not say she was innocent. She had learned long ago that innocence is not a thing the powerful can hear from the mouths of the poor. She only said, level and quiet, I'll leave them clean on your porch, Miss Marren. I don't keep what isn't mine. And she turned and carried his shirts out of the churchyard, and behind her the social closed over the moment like water over a stone. That same night, the Vance barn burned. It was the worst of them, that fire, because it was not empty. Tom Vance had gone out to the barn when he smelled the smoke to get the horses out, and the loft went before he did, and they found him in the morning under the burned beams. He left a widow. Nora Vance, 34 years old, with her husband's grave to dig and a claim the trust would come for by the end of the week, $40 in cash and a black field. She came to town 3 days later, gray-faced, to buy black cloth she could not afford, and Hettie took the mourning things from her hands at the shed door and told her there'd be no charge, the way she always did, and Nora Vance looked at her without really seeing her, because who sees the laundress on the worst day of her life, and went home to bury her man. The personal wound and the terrible one had fused now, in the same week, under the same sky. Hettie, fired after 12 years, called a thief before the whole valley. And Tom Vance dead in his barn. And a Bar M shirt, she would find, come home in that last wash before her firing, smelling of coal oil smoke, the collar scorched, dated the night before the church social. The fifth shirt. Laid in the trunk with the rest by a rule she'd kept so long she no longer thought about it, on the very day the man who'd worn it threw her into the dirt for a thief. She had a week to be out of the Bar M's good graces and out of her house, for the little plank house sat on ground the Marren interest held the paper on. And a fired laundress does not get to stay. She found a rented room over the hardware store, mean and small, and she began to pack her life into crates. And that is how she came, at last, to open the cedar trunk and truly look. It was evening. She'd meant only to move it, to see was it worth the hauling, or should she leave it. And she knelt and lifted the lid, and the dry cedar smell came up at her, and inside were the shirts. Folded, each with its little paper pinned. She lifted the top one, and it was the last, the collar scorched, the coal oil smell still in it faint under the cedar, and the date on its pin was the night before the church. Under it, another, and she began, without meaning to lay them out across the bare floor in the order of their dates, the way she'd have laid out a wash to sort it. And the room went very quiet, and the hair stood up on her arms, because for the first time in 3 years she was not seeing 5 ruined shirts, she was seeing a row of dates. And she knew those dates. She had lived them. That one, the smell of it, was the morning after the Ostergaard place burned, the fall her Amos was barely cold. That one was the week the Delgado claim went. That one the Kessler cabin. That one the barn where Tom Vance died. Every fire in the valley for 3 years, and beside each fire in her memory was a smoking, scorched shirt she had failed to clean, dated in her own careful hand. And a line in the Cheyenne paper swearing Silas Marren was 200 miles to the east on that very night. She sat back on her heels on the cold floor. She thought of the man on the church ground, smiling down at the top of her head. A woman who washes a man's shirts learns his size, nothing more. And a strange thing happened in Hettie Calloway, a thing that had nothing of rage in it, and everything of a great and terrible steadiness settling into place. Because she understood, all at once and to the bottom, what she held. Not 5 ruined shirts. A record. A dated, witnessed, physical record of where Silas Marren's hands had been on the nights he swore to the whole territory he was clean across it. She fetched her ledger down off the wash shelf, the cloth-bound book Amos had bought her, and she opened it beside the shirts on the floor, and she began to match them. Date to date. Fire to shirt to alibi. Her own small hand, kept faithfully for years, for no reason but a poor woman's fear of being called a liar, laid out now against the greatest lie in the valley. She was the only person in the territory of Wyoming holding a dated account of the Range War. The invisible woman. The one whose head a rich man had smiled down on. She had been standing at the very center of it the whole time, with the proof passing through her own red hands week after week, and no one had ever thought to wonder about the laundress, least of all the laundress herself. She did not sleep that night. She folded the shirts back exactly as they'd been, in their order, and she wrapped the first one, the Ostergaard shirt, the night her Amos died, on the very top, and she closed the lid. And she sat by the window in the mean rented room with the trunk at her knee, and she thought, all the long night through, about what a person like her could possibly do with a thing like this. A servant. A woman. A nobody. Who would hear her? Who in that valley would take the word of a fired laundress against Silas Marren and the Cattlemen's Trust and the bank and the sheriff who ate at Marren's table? She could take it to Sheriff Pruitt and be laughed out of the office and have the trunk gone by morning. She knew that much of the world. So she waited. Not from fear, though fear was in it. She waited because a careful woman does not spend the only card she will ever hold on a bad hand. She waited, and she watched the road, and she kept the trunk under her bed in the rented room, and told not one living soul. And then the word came up the street that the fall assizes were riding in the circuit court. Judge Ellery Crane, who was known even in that far country as a hard, honest man that no cattle money had ever bought, riding in to hear the term's cases, and with him a deputy United States Marshal named Boyd, because the fires had grown loud enough at last that the federal men had put a rider on the circuit to look into the burning of homesteads on the public land. They would set up in the clerk's office by the courthouse. They would be in Ashford Crossing a week. No more. And then they would ride on, and the chance would ride on with them, and it would not come again in Hettie Calloway's life. She dressed in her one good dark dress, the same she'd worn to the church, the same she'd been shamed in. She did it in the gray before dawn so the street would be empty. She had thought it through the whole night, and there was no fear left in her now, only that deep, settled steadiness, the calm of a woman who has finally understood what she is for. She would not shout. She would not beg. She had begged a rich man's pardon on her own porch once, and she had thanked him for robbing her, and she was done, to the end of her days, with begging. She would simply carry the truth in and lay it open on the table and let it be what it was. She knelt and pulled the cedar trunk from under the bed. Her mother's trunk, that smelled of the clean, dry West. 5 shirts inside, folded in their order, each pinned with its date, the Ostergaard shirt wrapped on top, and her cloth-bound ledger laid over them. 12 years of small, faithful writing, every dollar and every date and every quiet injustice she had never once been able to answer aloud. She lifted it in both arms. It was not heavy. It was the lightest heavy thing in the world. She went out into the empty street with the first light just touching the false fronts and the church steeple leaning against the pale sky, and she walked the length of Ashford Crossing, carrying the trunk before her, past the bank, past the hardware store, past the shuttered stores, where not a soul was yet stirring, to see the laundress pass, invisible, one last time. The clerk's office window showed a lamp already lit. She could see a shape moving behind it. The marshal, up early. She climbed the 2 board steps. She stood a moment with the trunk in her arms and the whole weight of 12 years behind her, and the fires of a valley folded against her chest, and she thought, plainly, in her own quiet voice, that a man who tells a woman she has learned nothing but his sighs had better pray she was never truly listening. Then, Hettie Calloway raised her red and steady hand, and she knocked on the door. The door opened, and the marshal stood there in his shirt sleeves, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He was not what she had pictured. Younger, tired around the eyes, he looked at her, and then at the trunk in her arms, and something in his face sharpened. "You're up early, ma'am." "So are you," Hettie said. "I've come to see the judge. And you, if you're the marshal." "Boyd," he said, "Deputy United States Marshal." "Judge Crane is inside." He stepped back to let her pass. "What have you got there?" She did not answer him standing in a doorway. She had rehearsed nothing, but she knew that much. Some things you set down on a table before you speak of them. Judge Ellery Crane sat at the clerk's long desk with a stack of papers and a pair of spectacles pushed up on his forehead. He was an old man, hard through the jaw, and he had the look of one who had heard every lie the frontier could invent and had grown very quiet from it. He watched her come in. He did not rise, and he did not smile, and Hettie was glad of it. She had not come for kindness. "Set it down," he said. She set the cedar trunk on the desk. It smelled of the clean, dry West, and, underneath that, faintly, of something burned. "My name is Hettie Calloway," she said. "I washed shirts for Silas Marren for 12 years. 3 winters back I stopped throwing the ruined ones away." She lifted the lid. "I'd like you to look at these." She took them out one at a time. 5 shirts, folded, each with a slip of paper pinned to the collar, and on each slip a date in her small, faithful hand. She laid the ledger down beside them, open. She did not raise her voice. She turned the pages, and she read the dates aloud, and then she read what the county paper had printed those same weeks. That Silas Marren had been in Cheyenne, 200 miles east, on the cattleman's business, and could not therefore have had any part in the misfortunes befalling the valley. The room went very still. Boyd set his coffee down without drinking it. He picked up the first shirt, the Ostergaard shirt, and he brought it to his face and he breathed it in, and Hettie watched his eyes change. Coal oil. 3 years in a cedar trunk, and it had never once let go. Judge Crane pulled his spectacles down onto his nose. He read the ledger a long while. He read every line. When he looked up, his voice had gone soft, and soft was worse than loud, on him. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "do you know what you're holding?" "I do now," she said. "I didn't for 3 years. I only found out the morning he fired me. Who else knows? Not a soul in this territory. I came here first." Crane and the marshal looked at each other over her head, and in that look passed something she could not read, some quick lawman's arithmetic. Then Boyd folded the shirts back into the trunk, gentle as a man handling powder, and he shut the lid. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to lock this in the county safe, and I'm going to ask you to do the hardest thing I've ever asked a witness to do. Say it. Go home. Go back to that man's wash, and act like this morning never happened. If Marren gets so much as a cold breath on the back of his neck, he'll be in Cheyenne again before I can swear a warrant, and everything you carried in here becomes a laundress's story against a rich man's word." He set his hand flat on the trunk. "This makes the case. But only if he doesn't know it exists." Hettie looked at the trunk. 12 years. Her whole quiet life folded into a cedar box. "He fired me," she said. "I'll have to ask him to take me back. Can you?" She thought of the church social. 60 faces. The bundle of shirts thrown down in the churchyard dust at her feet. She thought of thanking him, once, on her own porch, for the privilege of being robbed. "I've begged him before," she said. "I can do it one more time. If it's the last time." "It will be," the judge said. So she went home, and the next morning she walked out to the Bar M, with her head down and her hands folded, and she stood in Silas Marren's yard and asked him to let her have her place back. He kept her waiting on the step. He came out onto the wide porch of his fine house with his thumbs in his vest, and he looked down at her the way a man looks at a dog that has come back to a house it was whipped out of, and Hettie made her face empty and her shoulders round, and she was, for the last time in her life, invisible. And she let him see it. "I heard you'd taken a room over the hardware store," Marren said. "Come down in the world." "Yes, sir, and now you've come crawling." "I've no other trade, Mr. Marren, and no one else in the county keeps a house like yours needs keeping." That got him. She had known it would. She had washed his vanity as long as she had washed his linen, and she knew every seam of it. He rocked back on his heels, and he savored her a moment, and then he told her she could have her wash back at $2 a week, less than before, on account of the trouble she'd caused. And Hettie said, "Thank you, sir," and dropped her eyes, and thought. Write it down. She would. That night. Every dollar. The habit had made her, and it would not fail her now. She washed his shirts for 3 more weeks, and every one of them was evidence. That is the part that no one who has not lived a lie in daylight can rightly understand. She scrubbed his collars in the same tin tub. She starched his cuffs. She carried his linen up the same board steps and laid it folded on the same shelf, and behind her, in the county safe, the truth of him lay locked in cedar, and he did not know. He passed her in the yard and did not see her. He complained of a scorch she hadn't made and docked her for it, and she said, "Yes, sir," and wrote it down. And every petty cruelty was one more nail he was driving with his own hand. It nearly broke twice. The first was Halloran. The foreman had a nose for wrong, the way some dogs have, And one afternoon Hettie saw him standing across the street from the clerk's office with his hat pushed back, watching the window, and behind the glass, plain as day, was the tall shape of Marshall Boyd bent over a table. Halloran stood there a long minute. Then he turned his head, and he found Hettie at the pump with her wash basket, and their eyes met across the street, and she felt the whole thing tilt on its edge. She did not look away too fast. That was the trick of it. An honest woman looks up when a hard man stares, and looks down again, and goes on with her work, and thinks nothing. So Hettie let herself look at him the way she'd have looked at any idle man loafing where he'd no business, mild and a little wary, and then she bent to her basket and lifted it and walked off up the street with her back straight, a laundress about her trade. She did not hurry. Hurrying is what the guilty do. That night she lay awake a long while in the room over the hardware store with her heart going hard, and she thought, if he searches the room. And then she remembered. The trunk was in the safe. All that was under her bed now was a bundle of clean rags rolled up to look like something. A decoy Boyd himself had told her to keep there. Let him find rags. She breathed out slow, and she slept. The second was Nora. Nora Vance came into the mercantile the same morning Hettie was buying lye, and she was thin, thinner than at the funeral, with her husband 3 months in the ground and the trust's men already surveying his claim for Marren's fences. And when she saw Hettie, she came across the store fast, and there was a wildness in her face, grief gone to fury. And she caught Hettie's sleeve and said, "Low, but not low enough. They say the marshal's here. I'm going to him. I'm going to stand up in the street and tell every soul in this county what Silas Marren is, Nora." Hettie took her by both arms. The storekeeper was watching. A man by the door was watching. "Nora, hush now." "I won't hush. Tom's dead, and that man, I know what that man is." Hettie said it into her ear, quiet as a prayer, and something in her voice, some iron under the softness, stopped the girl cold. "I know better than you do. And I am asking you, for Tom, to be quiet 3 weeks more. Can you do that? 3 weeks. And then you'll have your say, and it will be in a place where it counts, and there will be men there who have to listen. But not here. Not in the street. In the street it's only noise, and noise he can buy his way clear of. Do you hear me?" Nora looked at her. Whatever she saw in Hettie's face, it reached her. The wildness went down like a flame under a lid. 3 weeks, she whispered. 3 weeks. Go home. Say nothing. And the girl went, and the moment passed, and Hettie stood in the mercantile with a cake of lye in her hand, and her knees not quite steady, and she thought that keeping a secret was heavier than any wash she had ever carried. Behind all of it, the paper trail thickened. She did not see it done, but Boyd told her a little, later, of how it went. A clerk at the Territorial Bank, a nervous young man with a conscience he'd mislaid and found again, opened his books to the marshal, and there it was in ink, every week a homestead burned in the Sweetbriar Valley, and every week after. The Cattlemen's Trust bought the abandoned deed for $40 a claim, land worth 10 times that, and Silas Marren's name behind the trust like a hand behind a puppet. The fires and the deeds lay in the ledger side by side, close as lovers. All it wanted was the shirts to tie the man to the flame. And then, in the second week of October, 3 weeks near to the day, Silas Marren learned that someone had been talking to the marshal. Hettie never knew who told him. It did not matter. What mattered was that she woke in the black hours before dawn to a red light moving on the ceiling of her room, and a smell she knew better than her own name, and she went to the window and saw her wash shed behind the hardware store standing in a sheet of fire. She stood at the glass in her nightdress and she watched it burn. She knew what it was. It was Halloran. And it was the trunk he was after, the trunk he thought was still in there among her tubs and her lines and her lye. He had come to burn the record to ash, the way he'd burned the Ostergaards and the Delgados and the Kesslers and Tom Vance in his barn. And for one long moment, watching the flames take the little building where she had earned her bread, Hettie felt the old cold drop of despair, the thought that it was all gone now. 12 years gone up in smoke like everything else that man had ever touched. Then she remembered. The trunk was in the safe. It had been in the safe 3 weeks. What burned out there was tubs and rope and a decoy roll of rags, and Silas Marren, reaching to destroy the last thing that could hang him, had only committed one more crime. And this one, had been watched. Because down in the shadow of the alley, where Boyd had posted him 3 weeks before to keep a quiet eye on the laundress and see that no harm came to her, a young deputy stood in the dark and saw a man he would later name as Deuce Halloran, foreman of the Bar M, strike a match against the shed wall and hold it to the coal oil he'd poured along the sill. Saw his face plain in the light of it, watched him mount and ride for the Bar M with the flames climbing behind him. Hettie learned all this after. That night, she only stood at the window and watched her shed burn, and did not weep. And when the bucket line formed in the street below, she went down and helped throw water like any neighbor, and no one saw her smile, because she did not smile. But something in her had gone very still and very sure. He had reached for the truth to kill it, and his own hand had swung the last door shut. The fall assizes opened the following week. They held it in the county courtroom, the biggest room in Ashford Crossing, and it was not near big enough. They came in from the whole valley. The burned-out families sat in the front rows, the Ostergaards and the Delgados and the Kesslers, and Nora Vance in her black, straight-backed, her eyes dry now and fixed forward. And behind them, filling every bench and standing along the walls, were the 60 souls of the Harvest Social, and a great many more. The same eyes that had watched Silas Marren throw a bundle of shirts at a laundress's feet and call her a thief in the churchyard. The wound had been public. They had all seen it. And now, they had come to see the rest. Silas Marren sat at the defense table in a fine dark coat, and he was not afraid. That was the thing Hettie marked, coming in. He was not afraid. He had his lawyer beside him from Cheyenne, and he had his money behind him, and he had 12 years of a servant's silence at his back, and he sat there certain as a church, because he could not conceive, he could not so much as imagine, that the woman who had scrubbed his collars could have brought him to this room. He looked at her once when she came in, and there was nothing in his face but a mild contempt, the look a man gives furniture that has been set in the wrong place. He did not know. Even now, he did not know. Judge Crane took the bench. The room stood and sat. And Marshal Boyd rose, and he carried the cedar trunk to the front of the court and set it on the evidence table, and Hettie saw Marren glance at it and glance away, incurious, her mother's trunk. It meant nothing to him. He had never once in 12 years wondered what a laundress kept at the foot of her bed. Boyd opened it. He did not speak at first. That was the marshal's own instinct, and it was a fine one. He simply lifted out the first shirt, the Ostergaard shirt, the one wrapped on top, and he unfolded it slow in the light of the tall courtroom windows, and he laid it flat on the table where the whole room could see the scorch along the cuff and the yellow stain of old smoke. And beside it he laid the slip of paper with its date, and beside that the ledger open to the same date, and beside that the county newspaper column, 3 years old, in which Silas Marren declared before all the territory that on that very night he had been dining in Cheyenne, 200 miles east. And the room went silent. It was a silence Hettie felt in her chest. She had heard the church go quiet the day he fired her, the awful indrawn hush of 60 people watching a woman shamed. This was the opposite of that silence, and it was made of the same held breath. The Ostergaards in the front row were leaning forward. Old man Ostergaard had his hat crushed in both hands. And they all understood, in that first shirt, before a single word of testimony, what they were looking at. A dead man's alibi laid beside the proof he was lying. Marren's lawyer was on his feet with an objection, and Crane put him down with 2 words, and Boyd went on. He laid the second shirt. The Delgado date. He laid the third. The Kessler date. Each one with its pinned slip and its ledger page and its newspaper column swearing the man was 200 miles gone. He built it on that table the way Hettie had never let herself build it, 1 shirt at a time, and with every shirt the silence in the room drew tighter, and up at the defense table Silas Marren's certainty began, for the first time, to crack. Then they called Hettie Calloway to testify. She rose, and she came forward, and she took the oath in her plain, steady voice, and she sat where they told her to sit, and she folded her red and work-hardened hands in her lap. She was not afraid either. She had thought she might be. She had thought her heart would go wild the way it had the night of the shed. But she sat there in the front of that crowded room with her whole life behind her, and she was calm, that deep, settled calm of a woman who has finally understood what she is for. Boyd asked her the questions, and she answered them plain. How long she had washed for the Marren house. 12 years. Why she had kept the ruined shirts. Because he had once accused her of stealing one and docked her $2 and a week's wages, and after that she never threw a garment away without proof she'd accounted for it, and she pinned the date to each because that was how her ledger ran. Dates and dollars, the only bookkeeping a poor woman had. When had she understood what the shirts were? Not for 3 years. The morning he fired her, packing to leave, she had laid them out together and read the dates. "And what did you find, Mrs. Calloway?" Boyd asked, "when you read the dates?" "I found," Hettie said, "that every shirt that came to me smelling of coal oil came the morning after a family in this valley lost their home. And that every one of those mornings, the paper said he was in Cheyenne." She heard the room stir behind her. She did not turn. Then, Marren's lawyer had his turn, and he tried to break her, the way they do. He asked her wasn't it true she'd been fired for theft. He asked her wasn't this the revenge of a dismissed servant. He asked her how a laundress could pretend to know one man's shirt from another, and Hettie answered him each time in the same plain voice, and to the last question she said, "I have washed that man's shirts every week for 12 years, sir. I know his collar from 100 collars in the dark. I know the set of his shoulders in the seam. There is not a woman living who knows Silas Marren's shirts as I know them." And she let that sit. And then? Because the moment had come and she had earned it, and no one on this earth was going to take it from her, she turned her head and she looked directly at Silas Marren for the first time, and she spoke to him, low and dry and without a shake in it. "You said a woman who washes a man's shirts learns his size, and nothing more." The room had gone dead still. "You said that to me in the churchyard, in front of 60 people, and then you threw my work in the dirt." "Well?" She held his eyes. "I learned your size, Mr. Marren, and every night your shirts came home to me, I learned whose barn you'd been standing in." Silas Marren came half out of his chair. There was no shout in her. That was what undid him. If she had screamed at him, he could have met it. He was a man built to meet noise with noise. But she said it the way she'd have priced a wash, flat and final, and it landed on him like the closing of a lid, and he came up out of his chair with his face gone from contempt to something that had no name, and his lawyer pulled him down, and Judge Crane's gavel came once, and the thing was done. The whole room had seen his face. His contempt for her was the very shape of the case against him, and now it was written on him for all of them to read. Then Deuce Halloran, sitting under guard at the side of the court with his own future closing on him like a hand, looked at the evidence table and saw, among the 5 shirts, one more the marshal had laid at the end. A 6th. His own, taken from him at his arrest, with the cuff singed and a long scorch up the sleeve, the shirt he had worn to burn a laundress's shed and had been fool enough to ride home in and fool enough not to burn himself. He looked at it a long moment. Then he stood, without being called, and he said, "Your Honor." I'll speak. I'll tell it. But I want it on the record I only did what I was told. And I'll say who told me. And he told them. He named Silas Marren. He named the nights and the barns and the orders given on the wide porch of the Bar M, and every word he spoke drove another plank into the floor beneath his master, and Silas Marren sat and listened to his own foreman hang him, and could not say a word, because every word Halloran spoke was already lying on that table in coal oil and old ink. Then the bank ledger was read. The nervous young clerk from the Territorial Bank stood and read out the deeds, each fire and, days after, the Cattlemen's Trust buying the ruined claim for $40, land worth 10 times that, and the officers of the trust who sat in the good seats near Marren went gray one by one as their names came off the page, and before the day was out, they were indicted with him. The whole rotten frame of it pulled into the light, and Sheriff Pruitt, who had worn the county badge through all of it and looked the other way for a cut of the trust's money, rose quietly from his bench near the back while the clerk was still reading, and made for the door. And Boyd's young deputy, the one who had watched the shed burn, was standing at that door, and he put out one hand and set it flat on the sheriff's chest and said, "Not loud, you'll want to stay, Sheriff. Judge'll want you." And Pruitt stopped, and turned, and came back, and sat down, and they took the badge off him there, in front of the whole county, before the session closed. Estelle Marren was not charged with much. A small thing. But Hettie thought of her, later Estelle, who had docked her $2 for a scorch she never made, all those years ago, the very injustice that had started Hettie keeping the shirts. $2. It was the first thread. Pull it, and the whole cloth of them came apart. The petty theft of a proud small woman had put the pin in the very first date, and every date after hung from it, and in the end the mightiest man in the Sweetbriar Valley was brought down off a $2 grudge kept faithfully by a widow with a ledger. Hettie did not laugh. But she thought God had a sense of proportion after all. Silas Marren was bound over for arson, for conspiracy, and for the death of Tom Vance in his burning barn. The court ordered the seized deeds restored to every family the trust had robbed, and Judge Crane, before he closed the assizes, looked down from the bench at the laundress in the front row and said, in the hearing of all of them, that in 30 years on the circuit he had never seen a case so plainly proved by a hand so patient, and that the territory owed its thanks to Mrs. Hettie Calloway, and the 60 who had watched him shame her turned in their seats and looked at her, and this time there was no contempt in it anywhere in the room. A year on, the starch dries white on the line in the Wyoming wind, and Hettie Calloway stands in her own yard, on her own ground, and watches it snap and billow in the clean, cold air. There is a painted sign over her door now. She had a man do it in blue and gold. Calloway Laundry, it says, her name and Amos's name, up where the whole street can read it. She owns the building under it, and the parcel of land it sits on, bought fair with money she earned, and no man on this earth can dock her $1 of it, or throw her work in the dirt, or call her a thief before her neighbors ever again. The Sweetbriar Valley is homesteads again. The trust is dissolved, its fences pulled, its deeds handed back one by one to the widows and the old men, and the families who had watered that ground with everything they had. Nora Vance is home on the Vance claim, and there is a new barn standing on it, raised in 3 days by 40 men of the valley, who came with their own timber and their own teams, and would not take a cent, and Hettie was there, and she brought the coffee and the bread, and she watched the roof go up against the sky, and thought of Tom Vance, and did not cry, because it was not a day for crying. Silas Marren breaks rock now for the territory, and they say he has not once, in all the time since, spoken the name of the woman who put him there. Deuce Halloran turned his evidence and saved his neck, and went west, and no one in the valley has heard of him since, nor wants to. And the Cattlemen's Trust is a word men say the way they say the name of a sickness that passed through once and took some good people and is gone. Inside Hettie's laundry, under the window where the good light comes in of a morning, There is a cedar trunk. Her mother's trunk, that smells of the clean, dry West. It is empty now. The shirts are in the county's keeping, filed and labeled, the record of a range war that one invisible woman carried folded against her chest through the dark to a lamplit door. She keeps the trunk for a bench. She sits on it sometimes in the evening when the wash is in and the day is done, and she looks out at the sign with her name on it, and she rests. She learned something, in all of it, that she would tell you if you asked, though she is not a woman given to speeches. The powerful never fear the ones who see them. They fear the ones who talk, the loud ones, the ones who threaten and rage, and those they can silence with money or with fire. But the quiet one, the one who is nothing to them, the one who carries their linen up the back stairs and is never once looked in the eye, she sees everything. She sees it all, and she writes it down, and she waits. And that is why, in the end, the quiet ones win. So if you have ever been treated as invisible while you saw everything, keep faith with the truth the way Hettie Calloway did. Write down the dates. Save the shirts. Your day comes. And when you watch this, tell me the town or the county you're watching from. I'd like to see how far this story rides.